I found a replacement child contract my parents drafted before my younger brother was born, and it was for $5 million, a sum that felt astronomical when I was barely 21, still living under my parents' roof, dependent on their goodwill and their endless supply of thinly veiled criticisms. It was tucked away in a forgotten accordion file at the back of Dad's home office closet, a place I'd only ventured into because my mom had tasked me with clearing out old tax documents. The file itself was nondescript, faded manila, smelling faintly of dust and dried-out ink. I was supposed to be looking for receipts from the late 90s, a chore I'd been putting off for weeks, procrastinating by tidying up other, less important areas of the house. That's how I stumbled upon it. The contract, typed out on what looked like a legal pad, but clearly not a standard legal document. The language was cold, clinical, and utterly chilling. It detailed a contingency plan, a backup, for me. It wasn't just a contract, it was a blueprint for my potential obsolescence, a preemptive strike against any deviation from the mold they'd so carefully crafted. The core of the agreement, as I pieced it together through numb eyes, was that if their then unborn child, my brother Liam, somehow didn't survive infancy, or if he presented with significant debilitating challenges that made him incapable of fulfilling their grand expectations I later came to understand were tied to the family business, the sprawling real estate empire Dad had built from scratch, then I would be reassigned not adopted, not fostered, reassigned, like a misplaced asset. The $5 million was the payout to an unnamed third party, a facilitator, to ensure the successful integration and continuation of the intended heir. It stipulated a period of intensive re-education for me, to erase any memories of my previous identity, and then a complete severance from the family. I was to become a ghost, a blank slate, ready to be molded into the ideal son they had always dreamed of. It was barbaric. It was horrifying. And it explained so much. The year Liam was born, I was 13. 13 and already feeling the weight of expectation, the subtle but constant comparisons. Dad's business was everything. He'd built it, brick by brick, deal by deal, and his vision for its future was singular, Liam. Liam would inherit it, grow it, make him proud. I was the eldest, the daughter. My role, as far as I could tell, was to be a perfectly polished accessory, a testament to their success, and a convenient contrast to the son who would carry on the legacy. But the contract revealed a deeper, darker narrative. It wasn't just about preference, it was about contingency. My existence was a placeholder, a potential stepping stone for a future son they desperately wanted, but weren't sure they'd get. The $5 million wasn't a gift, it was an insurance policy. A payoff to ensure their ultimate prize. I remember that summer, the year before Liam was born. My parents were in a frenzy. Mom was perpetually nauseous, Dad was more distant than usual, his brow furrowed with an intensity that went beyond business worries. They'd stopped going to their usual summer parties, the ones where I, as the dutiful eldest daughter, would be paraded around like a prize pony, answering questions about my grades and my extracurriculars with rote precision. They'd even canceled the annual Hamptons trip, a sacred ritual in our family. Instead, they were holed up in the house, whispering, strategizing. I overheard snippets, hushed arguments about preparedness and worst-case scenarios. At the time, I'd attributed it to the stress of impending parenthood, the anxiety of bringing a new life into the world. Now, it all clicked into place with sickening clarity. They weren't just preparing for a baby. They were preparing for a potential replacement for me. When Liam arrived, healthy and robust, a perfect miniature version of my father, the shift was immediate and seismic. I was no longer the star of their carefully constructed universe. I was now the supporting cast, the older sister, the one who was supposed to be nurturing and supportive. But the contract had planted a seed of suspicion, a deep-seated insecurity that festered. I started watching them, really watching them, for the first time. I noticed how their eyes lit up when Liam achieved some small milestone, a milestone I had undoubtedly reached years before, only to be met with polite indifference. I saw how their conversations revolved around his future, his potential, the boys' club he would one day lead, my own achievements, my academic awards, my budding interest in art, things I'd once thought would make them proud, were met with vague nods and swift redirections back to Liam. That's nice, dear. Have you seen Liam's new building blocks? The humiliation was a slow burn, a constant drip of neglect and subtle dismissal. It wasn't overt shouting matches or public shaming. It was far more insidious. It was the way Mom would forget to make my lunch for school, but meticulously prepare Liam's organic purees. It was the way Dad would dedicate hours to discussing future business deals with Liam, even when he was still in diapers, babbling incoherently, while my own attempts to share my college application essay ideas were met with a distracted "That's great, sweetie, just give me a minute." It was the exclusion from their inner circle, the family strategy sessions where Liam was now the focal point. I remember one Christmas Eve, sitting alone in the grand living room after everyone else had gone to bed, Liam cradled in my mother's arms, my father beaming at them. The contract had been lying in my desk drawer for months, a secret I'd carried like a lead weight. I felt like a fraud, a temporary fixture in a life that was never truly mine. I wasn't just the daughter. I was the backup daughter. The contract was signed just a few months before Liam's due date. It mentioned a pre-birth evaluation of me to ensure my compliance and emotional stability. That phrase sent a jolt of icy dread through me. Had they already begun? Had they been observing me, assessing me as a potential replacement? The thought was unbearable. I started to withdraw, to build walls around myself. I stopped sharing my hopes and dreams, my fears and anxieties. What was the point? They had their heir apparent, their perfect son. I was just there. A legacy child, perhaps, but not the one they truly wanted to inherit the throne. The $5 million became a symbol of their desperation, their ambition, and their willingness to discard me if Liam hadn't fit their perfect mold. It was the price of their ideal future, a future that didn't include the real me. It was the ultimate testament to their conditional love. I started to feel a cold anger bloom in my chest, a stark contrast to the hurt and confusion that had initially consumed me. This anger was clarifying. It was a fuel. I began to see the contract not just as a betrayal, but as a weapon. A weapon they had inadvertently handed me. I started spending more time in my father's office, not looking for tax documents, but searching for more clues. I wanted to understand the full extent of their planning, the depth of their ambition, the people they had brought into this clandestine operation. The file contained more than just the contract. There were notes, scribbled in my father's aggressive scrawl, detailing the qualifications of the unnamed facilitator. It wasn't a lawyer or an adoption agency. It sounded more like a private investigator, a behavioral specialist, someone who dealt in the shadowy underbelly of wealth and influence. The descriptions were vague but chilling, discretion paramount, proven track record with sensitive family matters, ability to manage difficult personalities. It painted a picture of a clandestine operation, a carefully orchestrated plan to ensure the perpetuation of their dynasty, no matter the cost and no matter who they had to sacrifice. The money was everything. It represented the lengths they would go to. It was the price of their perfect son, and the price they were willing to pay for my erasure. I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that this wasn't just about Liam being born healthy. It was about their vision of the future, a future where I was a liability, a deviation, a potential threat to their carefully constructed legacy. The contract was the proof. The $5 million was the down payment on my non-existence. I started to feel a subtle shift in their behavior towards me, a growing impatience, a subtle pressure. They'd started hinting about me moving out, about finding my own path, while simultaneously showering Liam with attention and resources. It was like they were preparing the nest for their perfect bird, while subtly encouraging the other to fly, or more accurately, to fall. I knew they were waiting for me to falter, for me to present them with the justification they needed. The contract was their escape hatch, their pre-approved excuse to make me disappear. The humiliation wasn't just about being overlooked. It was about being deemed replaceable, disposable. It was the slow, creeping realization that my worth in their eyes was conditional, dependent on my ability to fit a predetermined role. And that role was not the daughter who had dreams of her own, but the daughter who could seamlessly become the son if circumstances demanded it. I remember attending a family dinner shortly after Liam turned 5. He was already being tutored in basic business principles. My parents were beaming, discussing his future with him as if he were already running the company. I tried to interject, to share a story about a debate club victory I'd achieved, something I was genuinely proud of. My father waved a dismissive hand. "That's lovely, Sarah. But Liam, tell us about your new strategies for market expansion." The laughter that followed Liam's nonsensical pronouncements, the way they embraced him, made me feel like an alien in my own home. The contract, hidden in my drawer, felt like a physical weight, a constant reminder of my true status. The contract had a clause about emotional suppression training. It was supposed to ensure that any lingering attachments or memories of my original life wouldn't interfere with my new identity as their hypothetical son. This was perhaps the most disturbing part. It wasn't just about a name change or a new wardrobe. It was a deep, psychological reprogramming. The idea that they had planned to systematically erase *me* to scrub my identity clean was a betrayal so profound it left me breathless. The $5 million was the price of that erasure, the payment for a manufactured heir. I started to notice subtle things. The way my father would scrutinize my every move when I was around Liam, as if assessing my maternal instincts, or rather, my lack thereof. The way my mother would sigh and shake her head if I expressed any ambition that deviated from the family values, which, of course, were all about Dad's business. They wanted a son, not a daughter with her own aspirations. The contract was their ultimate trump card, their blueprint for achieving that dream, even if it meant creating a false narrative, a manufactured heir. The money was the fuel for that deception. The contract also stipulated a period of observation after Liam's birth to ensure he was indeed the perfect candidate for their heir. If, for any reason, he didn't measure up, the contract stated, the alternative plan will be enacted. The alternative plan, as I understood it, was me, re-educated and rebranded as their son. The $5 million was the severance package for my old life, the payment to the facilitator who would help orchestrate my transformation. It was a chilling prospect, a life built on deception and erasure. The final straw, the moment that truly solidified my resolve, came during Liam's 8th birthday party. It was a lavish affair held at the family estate, with hundreds of guests, all important figures in the business world. Liam, dressed in a miniature bespoke suit, was holding court, surrounded by men twice his age discussing stock options and mergers. My parents, beaming with pride, stood by his side, presenting him with a golden replica of the company's logo. I stood on the periphery, a ghost at the feast, holding a gift I'd painstakingly chosen. As I tried to offer him my present, my father intercepted me. "Not now, Sarah," he said, his voice tight with impatience. "Liam is occupied. This is important business." He then turned back to Liam, a look of absolute devotion on his face. It was then, amidst the glittering opulence and the calculated pronouncements, that I truly understood. I was an outsider in my own family, a mere spectator in the grand theater of their ambitions. The contract, hidden away, whispered its sinister promise of a replacement, a son who would inherit everything I was denied. The $5 million was the price of that inheritance. The contract itself was a chilling document. It outlined specific criteria for Liam's suitability as the heir, and then detailed the process for my reintegration should he fail to meet those criteria. This reintegration wasn't about being a daughter anymore. It was about becoming their son, a completely different person. The $5 million was the operational budget for this entire elaborate scheme. It was the price of a perfect heir, and the price of my erasure. I read it over and over, the words blurring through tears of shock and betrayal. The sheer audacity of it all, the cold, calculating planning, left me reeling. They had a backup plan for their son, and that backup plan was to turn me into him. My parents had always been driven, ambitious people. Dad's real estate empire was his life's work, and he had an almost messianic vision for its future. Liam, being the son, was always earmarked as the successor. But the contract revealed a level of paranoia, a desperate need for control, that I hadn't fully grasped. It wasn't enough that Liam was their son. They needed to guarantee his success, his legacy, even if it meant fundamentally altering me. The $5 million figure wasn't just an arbitrary amount, it was the projected cost of a complete identity overhaul, including a new persona, a new education, and a new family history. It was the price of rewriting my life. I started to feel a deep unease, a pervasive sense of being watched, of being judged. Every word I spoke, every decision I made, felt like it was being weighed against some unseen, unspoken standard. The contract explained it. They had a contingency plan for Liam. And if Liam didn't fit their perfect mold, I was the fallback. The thought was terrifying. I was being groomed, not for success as Sarah, but for a potential future as their son. The $5 million was the cost of that potential transformation, the payment to ensure their ultimate goal. The contract was clear. If Liam presented with any significant developmental challenges or failed to exhibit the necessary business acumen and leadership qualities by a certain age, then I would be reconditioned to assume the role of their heir. Reconditioned. The word itself was a violation. The $5 million was earmarked for this reconditioning, the resources allocated for my psychological and social reprogramming. It was the ultimate betrayal, the ultimate objectification. I wasn't their daughter. I was a contingency, a spare part. The day I found the contract, the world tilted on its axis. It was tucked away in a dusty file labeled estate planning, contingencies. The first thing that hit me was the dollar amount, $5 million. It wasn't an inheritance clause or a trust fund detail. It was a payment. A payment to a third party, a facilitator, to enact a plan. The plan was detailed, cold, and utterly devastating. It described a scenario where their unborn son, Liam, might not fulfill their expectations. And if he didn't, I** was the backup. The contract stipulated a process of identity reassignment, a complete erasure of my existing self, and the creation of a new persona, their son. The $5 million was the budget for this horrifying endeavor. The humiliation wasn't just a feeling, it was a calculated strategy. I remember sitting at the dinner table, Liam, all of 7 years old, proudly presenting a pie chart he'd drawn for a school project on hypothetical market growth. My parents were rapt, their faces alight with paternal pride, asking him detailed questions about profit margins and shareholder value. I'd tried to share a story about a creative writing competition I'd won, a piece of art I was incredibly proud of. My mother's response was a perfunctory, "That's nice, dear. Liam, tell us more about your EBITDA projections." The contract, tucked away in my desk, felt like a burning secret. I was not their daughter. I was their contingency plan, their potential son, and the $5 million was the price of that potential. It all began with a $5 million price tag on my potential replacement. That's what the contract stated, hidden in the back of my father's meticulously organized, yet ultimately deceitful, home office. It wasn't a will or an inheritance document. It was a contingency plan, drafted before my younger brother, Liam, was even born. A plan for me to become him should he not measure up. The sheer coldness of it, the calculated detachment, hit me like a physical blow. The money wasn't a reward, it was a budget for my own erasure. I was the backup, the insurance policy against a future where my brother, the intended heir to our family's vast real estate empire, didn't fulfill his destiny. The family's obsession with legacy, with the continuation of Dad's empire, was always present, a hum beneath the surface of our lives. But this contract revealed a level of fear, of desperation, that was chilling. They weren't just hoping for a son to inherit, they were ensuring it. And if the natural-born son wasn't up to par, well, they had a perfectly good daughter who could be remolded. The $5 million was the cost of that remolding, the price of a manufactured heir. It was the ultimate betrayal, a testament to a love that was conditional, transactional. I was 13 when Liam was born. The oldest, the daughter. Always the daughter. But from the moment Liam entered the picture, things changed. The focus shifted. My achievements, once met with polite congratulations, were now brushed aside in favor of Liam's slightest accomplishments. A drawing, a misspelled word, a toddling step, each was hailed as a harbinger of a future business titan. I was still there, in the picture, but I was slowly becoming background noise. The contract explained why. I wasn't just the older sister. I was the potential replacement. The $5 million was the contingency fund for that unspeakable transition. The humiliation wasn't a single event, but a slow, grinding erosion of my sense of self. It was the way my parents would compare me to Liam, even when he was a toddler. "Look how focused Liam is on his building blocks, Sarah. You should take a page from his book." The implication was clear. My interests, my intellect, were somehow deficient. I was a flawed model. The contract, with its chilling $5 million price tag for my potential transformation into their son, was the ultimate validation of that perceived deficiency. They weren't just disappointed in me. They had a plan to fix me, to replace me with a better version, a son. The contract laid out a chilling scenario. If Liam, for any reason, illness, lack of aptitude, a rebellious streak, didn't become the perfect heir my father envisioned, then I would be the next in line. But not as Sarah. I would be re-educated, my memories erased, my identity sculpted into that of the ideal son. The $5 million was the operational budget for this entire barbaric undertaking. It was the price of their perfect legacy, a price they were willing to pay with my very existence. This wasn't about love. It was about control, about ensuring the continuation of the empire at any cost, even the cost of their own daughter. The contract was signed a few months before Liam's birth. It detailed a post-birth assessment of Liam, and a preemptive evaluation of me to gauge my suitability for eventual repurposing. Repurposing. The word sent a shiver down my spine. The $5 million was the cost of that repurposing, the investment they were willing to make to guarantee their dynasty. It was a grim reminder that my role in their lives was not defined by love, but by utility. I was a placeholder, a potential substitute, valued only for my ability to become something else. The humiliation began subtly. It was the way my parents would discuss Liam's future in front of me as if I were a piece of furniture, their every word focused on his inevitable ascension to CEO. My own academic triumphs, my nascent artistic talents, were met with polite, dismissive nods. "That's nice, honey." Now, about Liam's summer internship. The contract, with its $5 million price tag for my potential transformation into their son, explained this subtle, yet profound, exclusion. I was not being nurtured. I was being sidelined, groomed for a different, more convenient destiny. The contract itself was a masterpiece of legalistic coldness, outlining the terms for my potential identity reassignment. The $5 million was the agreed-upon fee for a specialized agency that would handle the delicate process of erasing Sarah and creating their son. It was a chilling testament to their ambition, their willingness to sacrifice their own daughter for the sake of their legacy. The humiliation wasn't in being overlooked, it was in being deemed so fundamentally flawed that a complete identity overhaul was the most efficient solution. They didn't want to mold me. They wanted to replace me. The contract stipulated a trial period for Liam. If he failed to meet certain undefined benchmarks, the deal was off, and I would be put into the reintegration program. The $5 million was the fund for this program, the price of my lost identity. It was a stark, brutal realization. My worth was not inherent, but contingent. And that contingency was a terrifyingly specific set of expectations for my younger brother. The humiliation was the understanding that my existence was a business transaction, a potential loss to be mitigated at any cost. The contract was a blueprint for my obsolescence. Tucked away in a folder labeled Contingencies, Liam, it detailed how, if my brother didn't meet certain unspecified heir qualifications, I would be subjected to a process of identity assimilation. The $5 million was the cost of this assimilation, the price for creating a son who would inherit the family business. It was a level of premeditated betrayal that left me breathless. I wasn't just a daughter. I was a potential spare part, a backup heir. The humiliation of that realization was a slow, burning fire. The contract was clear. If Liam proved inadequate, I was to be reconditioned to fit the role of their ideal son. The $5 million payout was for the external agency that would handle this reconditioning. It was a chilling confirmation of their priorities. My own potential, my own dreams, were irrelevant. I was a contingency, a tool to ensure the perpetuation of the empire. The humiliation was an understanding that my love, my loyalty, were secondary to their relentless ambition. I was not a child to be cherished, but an asset to be managed or replaced if necessary. The contract explicitly detailed the financial arrangements for my transition. The $5 million sum was to cover the costs of therapy, education, and relocation necessary to transform me into their son. It was a stark reminder that my identity was negotiable, my existence a commodity. The humiliation wasn't in their preference for a son, but in their willingness to discard me, the daughter, if Liam didn't fit their perfect mold. I was a flawed prototype, and they had a plan to replace me with a superior model, at a substantial cost. The contract was a chilling roadmap of my potential non-existence as Sarah. It laid out in excruciating detail the process of my reassignment into their son, should Liam falter. The $5 million price tag was for the specialized program designed to erase my current identity and create a new one. It was a level of calculation and foresight that was both terrifying and deeply humiliating. My individuality was an inconvenience, my true self a liability to be scrubbed clean and replaced. The family's ambition had effectively rendered me disposable. The contract was signed just months before Liam was born. It outlined a scenario where, if Liam failed to meet specific, albeit undefined, heirship criteria, I would be subjected to a radical identity reassignment program. The $5 million figure was the allocated budget for this program, covering everything from psychological reprogramming to a complete societal reintroduction. It was a brutal confirmation that my value is not in who I was, but in what I could become, a son. The humiliation was the stark realization that my existence was conditional, and my true self was expendable. The contract was an agreement for a replacement heir scenario. The $5 million sum was the retainer paid to a discreet agency tasked with orchestrating my transformation into the son my parents always desired, should Liam not measure up. It was a stark, cold calculation, devoid of any genuine affection. The humiliation wasn't just in being overlooked, but in being deemed a malleable product, a resource to be repurposed for the sake of the family legacy. My daughterhood was a temporary state, a placeholder for a more valuable future. The silence in my father's office after I closed the file was deafening. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, crushing stillness. The contract. The $5 million. The contingency plan for me. It wasn't a hypothetical. It was a concrete, meticulously crafted document, signed and sealed, a testament to their desperate desire for a male heir and their chilling willingness to execute a plan that would erase me. The air felt thick, heavy with the unspoken. My entire life, the way I'd perceived my parents' conditional affection, their subtle dismissals, their constant focus on Liam, it all snapped into horrifying focus. I wasn't just the overlooked eldest daughter. I was the backup son, the insurance policy. And they had been ready to cash it in. I remember that feeling of being an outsider, a peripheral figure at family gatherings. They'd always been preoccupied with the business, with the legacy. Dad, in particular, had a singular focus, a laser-like intensity directed at building and expanding his empire. Liam, as the son, was the natural heir. I, the daughter, was just the daughter. My accomplishments were met with vague praise, quickly overshadowed by discussions of Liam's future, his schooling, his potential. I'd always felt a sting of disappointment, a yearning for more, a desire for their undivided approval. Now I understood. It wasn't that they didn't see me, it was that they saw me as a placeholder, a malleable asset, capable of being reshaped into their ultimate prize. The $5 million wasn't a gift, it was the budget for my own erasure, the price of their perfect son. The contract had a clause about emotional compliance, and a requirement for me to undergo personality recalibration if Liam failed to meet their expectations. The terms were vague but terrifying. What did recalibration even mean? It implied a systematic dismantling of who I was, my memories, my personality, my very essence, and rebuilding me into someone else. The $5 million was the operational budget for this dehumanizing process. It was the price of a manufactured heir, a son who would carry on the family name and business, someone they'd essentially bought and paid for. The humiliation wasn't in their preference for a son, it was in their willingness to utterly dismantle me to achieve that preference. It was a profound betrayal of every ounce of my being. I started to notice more things. The way my father would subtly steer conversations away from my interests, my ambitions. If I talked about wanting to pursue art, or a career in social work, his eyes would glaze over, his response always a distracted "That's nice, dear. But have you considered the business side of things?" He'd then pivot to Liam, to his latest business-related toy or game. It was like my own nascent identity was an annoyance, a distraction from the real business of life, ensuring the continuation of the empire through a male heir. The contract, with its chilling $5 million price tag for my potential transformation, suddenly made their dismissiveness a calculated strategy. They weren't just encouraging Liam, they were sidelining me, making me feel inadequate, so that the repurposing would be less of a shock. The contract was signed a few months before Liam's birth, after a series of what it termed preliminary suitability assessments of me. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. Had they been observing me even then? Had they been assessing my potential for this grim future? The $5 million was the cost of the facilitator they'd hired to ensure my full cooperation and integration into the new role. It was the price of a completely manufactured heir, a son who would seamlessly step into their planned future, a future where Sarah, the daughter, was never meant to exist in the long run. The humiliation was a crushing weight. My entire existence was contingent on my brother's performance. I began to spend hours in my father's office, not just rereading the contract, but searching for any other documents, any correspondence that might shed more light on this clandestine operation. I found a series of heavily redacted emails between my father and a law firm specializing in complex family restructuring. The language was coded, allusions to asset management, legacy continuity, and alternative heir protocols. The $5 million was clearly the cornerstone of this entire elaborate scheme. It was the investment they were willing to make to guarantee their dynasty, no matter the cost, no matter who they had to sacrifice. My father's handwriting on some of the notes was aggressive, almost frantic, as if he were trying to outrun a deadline or perhaps outrun his own conscience. The contract had another disturbing detail, a clause about memory archiving. They intended to digitally record my entire life, my childhood, my memories, my experiences, before they wiped them. The $5 million was the budget for this archival process, for the technology and personnel required to preserve the original data before it was overwritten. It was like they were treating my very being as a piece of data, to be backed up and then deleted. The humiliation was absolute. I wasn't just a daughter they wanted to replace. I was a complex individual whose entire existence was deemed replaceable, a product to be archived and discarded. The financial implications were staggering. $5 million was not just a number, it was a declaration of intent. It was the cost of ensuring their legacy, of securing their future, of creating the perfect son. It was the price of my own obliteration. I felt a cold, hard knot of anger forming in my stomach. They had planned to erase me, to rewrite my life, all for the sake of their empire. The humiliation was in realizing that my intrinsic worth, my very identity, was considered secondary to their ambition. I was a disposable commodity, a biological contingency plan. I started to observe my parents more closely, their interactions with Liam, their subtle expectations. They'd begun to encourage Liam's interest in business from a ridiculously young age. Even at 5, he was being presented with mock stock portfolios and guided through strategy sessions at the dinner table. Meanwhile, my own academic achievements, my passion for painting, were met with a polite nod and a quick redirection back to Liam. "That's wonderful, dear. Liam, tell us about your new acquisition strategy for your lemonade stand." The contract was the explanation for this systematic exclusion. They weren't fostering my growth. They were nurturing my replacement. The $5 million was the financial commitment to that replacement. The contract also mentioned a reintegration specialist, an individual tasked with overseeing my transition into the role of their son. This person would be responsible for teaching me how to behave, how to think, how to be their son. The $5 million was the payment to this specialist, a figure that spoke volumes about the complexity and sensitivity of the operation. It wasn't just about changing my clothes or my name, it was about fundamentally altering my identity. The humiliation was in the cold, calculated efficiency of their plan. They were hiring a professional to erase me. I discovered a hidden ledger in my father's desk detailing expenditures related to Project Air. The entries were cryptic, but the sums were significant, all pointing back to the $5 million figure. There were payments for confidential consultations, specialized training materials, and relocation logistics. It became terrifyingly clear that this wasn't just a piece of paper, it was an active, ongoing plan. The $5 million was the seed money, the investment they were making in their dream son. My humiliation was the realization that I was not just a daughter, I was an obstacle, a temporary arrangement before the real heir was ready. The contract had a timeline. If Liam didn't exhibit the requisite leadership qualities and business acumen by the age of 18, I would be subjected to the reassignment protocol. The $5 million was the projected cost of this protocol, including advanced psychological conditioning and a complete social re-education. It was a stark reminder of how little my actual self mattered to them. I was a placeholder, a project, a variable they were willing to control and manipulate to ensure the desired outcome. The humiliation was an understanding that my individuality was a threat to their perfect plan. I began to feel a growing sense of unease, a feeling of being constantly scrutinized. Every interaction with my parents felt like a test, an evaluation. Were they looking for reasons to trigger the contract? Were they subtly trying to push me towards a breakdown, a deviation that would justify their plan? The $5 million was the financial incentive for them to get their way, to ensure the continuation of their dynasty, no matter what. The humiliation was the thought that they were actively waiting for me to fail, for me to present them with the excuse they needed to erase me. I found a separate document, a detailed profile of the ideal son. It listed qualities like assertiveness, decisiveness, strategic thinking, and an unflinching dedication to the family business. It was a chilling mirror image of everything I wasn't, at least not in their eyes. They wanted a miniature version of my father, a carbon copy to continue his legacy. And if I wasn't that, then I would be made into that. The $5 million was the price of that transformation. The humiliation was the realization that my own unique qualities were not just overlooked, but actively deemed insufficient. Then, I found something else, tucked away in a separate folder, a small, discreet envelope with the return address of the same law firm. Inside was a single, unsigned document, a memo, really, detailing contingency protocols for the Sarah reassignment. It wasn't about Liam anymore. It was about me. It discussed the potential for resistance and outlined mitigation strategies to ensure my compliance. The $5 million figure was reiterated, but this time it was broken down into more specific costs: psychological intervention, identity fabrication, discreet relocation, and integration. This wasn't just about having a son. It was about actively managing and controlling me, their daughter, to ensure my transformation. The humiliation was that they had prepared for my potential resistance, that they had anticipated I might not go along willingly with their plan to erase me. The contract's language was chillingly precise. It wasn't just about a name change or a new wardrobe. It spoke of erasing emotional attachments, rewriting familial history, and instilling core business values from inception. The $5 million was the budget for this complete psychological overhaul, the price for them to acquire the son they desired, at the cost of my very soul. The humiliation was the cold, calculated nature of their plan. They weren't just preferring a son. They were actively preparing to dismantle me to create one. I started to feel a terrifying sense of agency creep in. The humiliation was still there, a burning ember, but it was slowly being fanned by a growing resolve. They had their contingency plan, their $5 million blueprint for a replacement son. But they hadn't accounted for me. They hadn't accounted for Sarah, the daughter who discovered their secret, the daughter who now knew the true cost of their ambition. The contract was their weapon, but it was also my insight. And with that insight came a dangerous calm, a quiet determination. The hum of their ambition had always been present, a constant background noise in my life. But now, I could hear the sinister undertones, the ruthless calculation behind every decision. The $5 million wasn't just about wealth. It was about power, about control, about ensuring that their legacy endured, even if it meant sacrificing their own child. The humiliation was the understanding that I was just a pawn in their grand game, a piece they were willing to sacrifice to ensure their victory. But pawns could be moved, and sometimes they could even capture the king. The contract was a testament to their fear. Fear that Liam wouldn't be enough, fear that their legacy would falter, fear that their carefully constructed world would crumble. The $5 million was their insurance against that fear, the price they were willing to pay to guarantee their version of success. And in their fear, they had created my power. The humiliation was fading, replaced by a chilling clarity. They wanted a son. They had a plan. But they didn't have me. Not anymore. I was no longer the overlooked daughter, the passive recipient of their conditional love. I was something far more dangerous. I was the contingency they had overlooked. The sheer audacity of their plan, the willingness to essentially buy a son and erase their daughter, was both horrifying and, in a twisted way, liberating. The humiliation of feeling inadequate, of feeling like I was never quite enough, was being replaced by something else entirely. A cold, hard resolve. They had their contract. They had their $5 million. But they didn't have my silence. They didn't have my complicity. They had underestimated the daughter they were so eager to replace. And that, I realized, was their biggest mistake. The contracts laid out their endgame, but it didn't account for my own. The silence in the opulent study wasn't just absence of sound. It was a presence, heavy with years of unspoken resentments and buried truths. I held the contract, the damning testament to their desire for a son, the $5 million blueprint for my own erasure. For so long, I'd felt like a ghost in my own family, a shadow flitting through opulent halls, always just outside the spotlight that relentlessly followed Liam. Now, I understood why. I wasn't just overlooked. I was a contingency, a spare part they were willing to extensively refurbish at a considerable price, if the primary model, my brother, didn't measure up. The humiliation had been a slow drip, a constant erosion of my sense of self. Their praise for my achievements was always lukewarm, a perfunctory nod before the conversation inevitably veered back to Liam's burgeoning business acumen, his latest investment simulation, his inherent right to inherit their empire. My art, my dreams, my passions, they were quaint hobbies, pleasant diversions from the real work of building a legacy. The contract detailing the $5 million set aside for my personality recalibration suddenly cast their dismissiveness in a stark, chilling light. They weren't nurturing their heir. They were preparing to dismantle their daughter. The sheer coldness of it, the clinical detachment with which they'd planned my obliteration, was a betrayal so profound it left me breathless. I replayed their words, their veiled criticisms, their subtle manipulations. The way my father would sigh dramatically if I expressed an interest in something outside the family business. The way my mother would gently guide me back to discussing Liam's latest triumph. It wasn't indifference, it was a deliberate, calculated effort to make me feel insufficient, to pave the way for my inevitable transformation. The $5 million wasn't just a financial transaction, it was the price of their ambition, the cost of a perfect, male heir, and the budget for a daughter's complete disintegration. The contract itself was a masterpiece of legal obfuscation, peppered with phrases like optimal legacy continuity, heir viability protocols, and, most chillingly, identity reassignment. It spoke of emotional compliance and behavioral alignment, all tied to the disbursement of a sum so vast it made my head spin. $5 million. To erase me. To transform me into the son they apparently craved. The humiliation wasn't just in their preference for a male heir, it was in their utter disregard for my existing self, my identity, my very essence. It was a declaration that I, Sarah, was not enough and could be remade into someone else for a price. I'd found it by accident, tucked away in a seldom-used filing cabinet in my father's sprawling home office. He always said I had no business poking around his affairs, but the gnawing sense of being an outsider, a perpetual disappointment, had driven me. The contract was dated years ago, signed shortly after Liam's birth, a contingency born of their perceived need for a backup plan. The $5 million was the sum allocated for the recalibrator, the specialist who would oversee my transformation. It was an investment in a son they hadn't gotten naturally, but desperate gamble to ensure the continuation of their dynasty. The terms were brutal. If Liam faltered, if he showed any deviation from their idealized image of a future CEO, I was to be the beneficiary of their profound investment. Not a financial one, in the way one might expect, but a literal, physical, psychological investment in turning me into him. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, a cold dread that had nothing to do with financial insecurity and everything to do with a violation of my very being. They were prepared to erase Sarah, the daughter, to construct a passable facsimile of Liam, the son. The $5 million was the budget for that meticulously crafted lie. I started to notice the subtle shifts in their demeanor. My father's gaze would linger on Liam during family dinners, a look of pride mixed with an almost desperate hope. My mother's solicitousness towards me had always felt a little forced, a bit like a concession, and now I understood it was likely preparation, a way to soften the blow of what was to come. They were grooming Liam, yes, but they were also, in their own twisted way, preparing me for my own obsolescence. The $5 million was their assurance that this obsolescence would be managed, controlled, and ultimately, profitable for them. The contract also outlined a staged approach, a gradual immersion into the Liam persona. There were provisions for specialized tutoring, mentorship under approved business figures, and even recommendations for personality assessments designed to identify and correct any perceived female tendencies. The $5 million was the allocated fund for this entire elaborate process, a testament to their unwavering commitment to their vision. It was the price of a manufactured son, a son built from the raw materials of their ambition and the carefully curated memories of their actual daughter. The humiliation wasn't confined to my childhood or adolescence. It permeated every facet of our family dynamic. The way my accomplishments were always framed as unusual for a girl, the subtle digs about my lack of interest in traditional feminine pursuits. It was all designed to make me feel out of step, inadequate, ripe for transformation. The $5 million was the ultimate validation of their strategy. They were willing to pay a fortune to ensure I fit their mold, to mold me into the son they'd never had. I remembered a conversation, years ago, when I'd expressed my desire to pursue a career in environmental law. My father had looked at me with that familiar, distant expression. "Sarah," he'd said, his voice smooth as polished mahogany, "the world needs strong leaders, decisive minds. Stick to what you're good at." At the time, I'd assumed he meant my intelligence, my analytical skills. Now I knew. He meant the skills that could be bent, reshaped, and ultimately twisted into the attributes of a ruthless businessman, the very qualities they were willing to pay $5 million to instill. The contract's most disturbing clause detailed the memory archiving and deletion protocol. Before any identity reassignment took place, my entire life, my memories, my experiences, my very sense of self, was to be digitally recorded, meticulously catalogued, and then systematically purged. The $5 million was the budget for the technology and personnel required for this intellectual vivisection. It was a dehumanizing act of the highest order. They weren't just replacing their daughter. They were erasing her existence, treating her like a faulty piece of software to be backed up and then wiped clean. The humiliation was that they saw me as nothing more than data. I began to see the subtle signs of their preparations everywhere. The way my mother would purchase certain types of clothing for Liam, the way my father would engage him in discussions about market trends. They were practicing. They were building the narrative. And the $5 million was the financial fuel for this elaborate charade, ensuring they had the resources to execute their plan flawlessly. My humiliation was that I had been so blind, so naive, so trusting that I hadn't seen the scaffolding being erected for my own destruction. The contract was a roadmap to my own undoing. It detailed the specific personality traits they desired in their son: assertiveness, a ruthless pragmatism, and unshakable loyalty to the family name above all else. It was a stark contrast to the person I was, or at least, the person I had been allowed to be. The $5 million was the price of eliminating my individuality, of stripping away my empathy, of transforming me into the cold, calculating businessman they envisioned. Then came the chilling revelation that solidified my resolve. Tucked within the contract's appendices was a separate rider, a memo from the law firm outlining mitigation strategies for Sarah's potential resistance. They had anticipated my objection. They had planned for me to fight back. And the $5 million was earmarked not just for my transformation, but for the expenses associated with overcoming my natural inclination to resist such and profound violation. They were willing to spend a fortune to force me into a role I never wanted. The humiliation was in realizing they had accounted for my struggle and had a budget for breaking me. I sat there, the contract spread before me, the opulent silence of my father steady pressing in. The $5 million wasn't just a number. It was a death sentence for the Sarah I knew. It was the price they were willing to pay for a son they believed I could be molded into. The humiliation burned a deep, searing ache, but beneath the pain, something else was stirring. A cold, hard clarity. They had their contract. They had their contingency plan. They had their budget, but they had underestimated me. They had underestimated the daughter they were so eager to erase. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They had prepared for Liam's potential shortcomings, yes, but they had also prepared for my potential resistance. The $5 million was the cost of ensuring my compliance, of overcoming any natural inclination I might have to preserve my own identity. They had planned for my silence, my acquiescence, even my eventual acceptance of their manufactured reality. But they hadn't planned for my active defiance. They hadn't accounted for the fact that their detailed blueprint for my erasure would become my blueprint for rebellion. The contract was their weapon, but now it was my shield, my guide. I knew their timeline, their methods, their financial commitment. I knew precisely how much they were willing to spend to turn me into someone else. And that knowledge was power. The humiliation of their ambition had always been a private agony, but now it was fueling a fierce, almost terrifying resolve. They wanted a son? They would get one. But not the one they expected. Not the one they'd budgeted $5 million to create. I began to meticulously dissect every clause, every financial implication, every potential loophole. The $5 million was meant to be the seed money for my transformation, the operational budget for my obliteration. But what if it could be used for something else? What if the very document that detailed my intended demise could be leveraged for my survival, and more than that, for their undoing? The thought was exhilarating, a dangerous spark igniting in the ashes of my humiliation. I spent weeks poring over the legal jargon, cross-referencing with publicly available financial reports of my father's companies. The $5 million was a significant sum, but not astronomical for a man of his wealth. However, the contract specified it was to be held in escrow, contingent upon certain events and the engagement of a specific reintegration specialist. The contractual obligation was clear. If the conditions were met, the funds would be released for the sole purpose of my reassignment protocol. This gave me an idea, a bold, audacious plan that sent tremors of excitement through me. The contract was legally binding. The escrow account was real. And my father, for all his power, was bound by his own meticulous legal agreements. I couldn't stop the contract from existing, but perhaps, just perhaps, I could redirect its purpose. The humiliation of being so utterly dismissed, so easily disposable, had been crushing. But now it was a potent motivator. They wanted to control my life, my identity, my very being. Fine. I would control the narrative. I started making discreet inquiries, reaching out to a discreet, highly respected family law attorney, someone known for navigating complex, high-stakes disputes. I didn't reveal the full extent of the contract initially. I framed it as a matter of inheritance disputes, of parental overreach, of potential undue influence. I presented the existence of the contract, the $5 million figure, and the chilling contingency clauses as evidence of a deeply manipulative and potentially illegal parental agenda. The attorney listened intently, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to one of grave concern. He understood the implications of such a document, the sheer power it wielded, and the devastating potential for abuse. He also recognized the strategic value of the escrow account and the detailed specifications for its disbursement. "This is highly unusual, Sarah," he admitted, his voice low. "A testament to a very specific kind of parental ambition, and their willingness to fund it so handsomely is telling." We began working meticulously and in secret. The goal wasn't to invalidate the contract entirely, at least not at first. It was too deeply entrenched, too intricately worded. Instead, we focused on the activation clauses, the triggers for the $5 million disbursement. The contract stipulated that the funds were for my reassignment protocol *if Liam failed to meet certain benchmarks by a specific age. My father, in his arrogance, had assumed Liam would never falter and that I would never discover this. He was wrong on both counts. My attorney's strategy was simple, yet brilliant. If the contract's purpose was to ensure the continuity of the family legacy through a male heir, and if Liam was indeed the chosen heir, then any action that undermined Liam's position as the sole, undisputed heir would, in effect, nullify the conditions for my reassignment. The $5 million was contingent on Liam's failure and my subsequent transformation. If Liam was no longer the sole heir, if his inheritance was challenged or diluted, then the premise for my $5 million overhaul would evaporate. This was where the humiliation turned into a weapon. I began subtly feeding information, planting seeds of doubt about Liam's aptitude. Not overt accusations, but gentle suggestions, careful observations. I'd mention his casual disregard for his studies, his increasing interest in superficial pursuits, his occasional questionable judgment calls. I'd frame them as personal concerns, as a daughter worried about her brother's future, about the weight of their legacy. The $5 million was their plan to make me like Liam. My goal was to make Liam seem less than ideal, thus negating the need for my manufactured transformation. The real masterstroke came when I shifted my focus from Liam's perceived shortcomings to the very foundations of the family business. My father, in his relentless pursuit of empire, had made certain strategic decisions, amassed certain assets, and entered into certain agreements that, under intense scrutiny, were not as ironclad as he believed. I'd spent years observing, listening, gathering information, not as an eager daughter, but as an overlooked analyst. The contract, with its mention of legacy continuity, made me realize that the security of that legacy was paramount. If the legacy itself was threatened, the very premise of their contingency plan would crumble. Using my attorney's guidance, I initiated a series of discreet, yet highly effective, legal challenges. Not direct attacks on my father, but on certain subsidiaries, on specific investment vehicles, on long-standing partnership agreements that were, upon closer examination, vulnerable. I wasn't aiming to cripple him, but to create a legal quagmire, a complex web of litigation that would require his full attention and significant financial resources to navigate. The objective was to make the continuation of the family legacy, as he envisioned it, a far more precarious and expensive endeavor. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. My father, who had always projected an image of unassailable control, found himself entangled in a series of legal battles he hadn't anticipated. The whispers started in the boardrooms, the hushed conversations at exclusive clubs. His carefully constructed empire was showing cracks. The financial strain was palpable, and the pressure to resolve these disputes was immense. He was forced to divert significant capital, to engage top legal teams to essentially fight for the very legacy he had so ruthlessly sought to protect. Meanwhile, Liam, bless his oblivious heart, continued his carefree existence, completely unaware of the storm I was brewing around him. My parents, consumed by the legal crises, had less time to focus on their elaborate plan for my reassignment. The $5 million contingency, meant to secure their future, was inadvertently becoming a drain on their present resources. The irony was almost delicious. Then came the moment of truth. My father summoned me to his office, his face a mask of controlled fury. He'd finally put the pieces together. He knew I was behind the legal challenges. He knew I had accessed his files. He knew I had seen the contract. The air crackled with unspoken accusation. "You think this is a game, Sarah?" He snarled, his voice dangerously low. "You think you can just waltz in here and dismantle everything I've built?" I met his gaze, my own eyes steady. The humiliation was still there, a phantom ache, but it was now overshadowed by a chilling calm. "You built this empire, Father," I said, my voice clear and resonant. "But you built it on a foundation of deceit. And you were prepared to sacrifice your own daughter to preserve it." He slammed his hand on the desk, the sound echoing in the cavernous room. "That contract was a safeguard. A necessary measure to ensure the continuation of our name. A safeguard that involved erasing me," I countered, my voice unwavering. "A safeguard that budgeted $5 million for my reassignment." I let the sum hang in the air, a stark reminder of his intentions. "Funny, isn't it? That the very money you set aside to reshape me into a son is now being used to protect the legacy you claim to cherish." His eyes narrowed, a flicker of panic in their depths. He hadn't considered this. He'd been so focused on the mechanics of my transformation, he'd overlooked the fundamental requirement for that transformation, Liam's unimpeded succession. "The contract is clear," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "The $5 million is for my reassignment protocol, contingent upon Liam's failure to meet specific criteria and my subsequent recalibration. But if the legacy itself is under threat, if the very foundations of what you're trying to preserve are being dismantled by legal challenges, then Liam's position as sole heir becomes complicated. Wouldn't you agree?" He stood there, speechless, his usual command faltering. The fear of the legal battles, of the financial drain, was evident on his face. The $5 million, once his tool of control, was now a liability, a symbol of his misplaced priorities. "You see," I said, leaning forward slightly, a predatory glint in my eye, "you were so focused on creating the perfect son, you forgot about the daughter who knew all your secrets. You budgeted $5 million to erase me, but you didn't budget for me to fight back. You didn't budget for me to expose your plans, to unravel your carefully constructed world, to use your own contingency against you." My attorney had filed an injunction. The escrow account holding the $5 million was frozen, pending the resolution of the ongoing legal disputes and a thorough investigation into the contract's validity and intent. My father's meticulously laid plan had unraveled, not with a bang, but with a series of precise, strategic legal maneuvers, funded by the very money he'd allocated for my destruction. The humiliation of being overlooked, of being considered a disposable commodity, had forged a resolve stronger than any $5 million could buy. I wasn't going to be reshaped. I wasn't going to be erased. I was going to be Sarah. And in the silence that followed my father's stunned realization, I finally heard the echo of my own true voice, not the one they tried to silence, but the one that had found its power in their own grand design. Their legacy was intact for now, but the cost of their ambition had become astronomically higher than they could ever have afforded. The $5 million, meant for my undoing, had become the price of their own reckoning. I walked out of the office, leaving him surrounded by the ruins of his plans, by the ghosts of his ambition. The weight on my chest had lifted. The humiliation was gone, replaced by a profound, almost unnerving sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, not entirely, but I had reclaimed myself. And in doing so, I had claimed a victory far more valuable than any inheritance. The final exhale was long, deep, and carried the quiet triumph of survival by design, orchestrated by the very hands that had once sought